So half of this lecture will actually be quite basic, because I'll present some basic mechanisms which are part of the DFT framework by now. And then part of it will be examples of where we have used these mechanisms in some architectures. And those might seem a little bit advanced, but I'll go through them slowly. I don't have too many slides, so we don't need to hurry. Like, even if we want to finish earlier, we're still okay in time. So feel free to ask questions anytime. I can tell you much more than what I have on the slides. So if you think it's a bit too fuzzy and you don't understand anything, just ask questions anytime, okay? So I'll start fairly far with the question, what is learning at all? So if you look in the Wikipedia, that's what you will find. So learning is the act of acquiring new something or changing something that you had. And the something can be either knowledge, or it can be new behavior, some new skill, or maybe new values or preferences. So learning is an act of getting some new information. On the mechanistical side, on the side of the mechanisms, learning produces changes in an organism, or more precisely in the neural system of the organism in our case. And these changes are relatively permanent. That's kind of the definition, what is learning. Now, if you look at what people call learning in different disciplines, then you'll find quite different things. For instance, in machine learning, learning is the process of some algorithm to learn to classify stuff, classify patterns, or classify sounds, or classify images. So basically what the system is doing, it looks at millions and millions of images and gets the label, a car, a tree, a car, a tree, and after a while it gets a new image and it can tell you a car or a tree. So it's a classifier. A more general thing of how to describe such systems would be that it learns to approximate different functions. So if you get some input, your learner will learn to get you the output that you wanted to get. Or another type of a task the systems can accomplish is discover some dependencies in your data. So it's all about data and then doing something like simplifying this data in some way or extracting some regularities in this data. So basically this type of learning is a kind of math. It's like a fancy name for 19th century math, statistics, representing data in an efficient way or in a task-dependent way. This is one type of learning, what people call learning. If you look at animal learning literature, that's a completely different story. What you can see there is that animals don't learn too much and too quickly. It's very hard to learn them to do anything. And there are basically only maybe three things you can do. You can either do classical conditioning or instrumental conditioning and work with habituation. So that's basically it, what the animals can do. So you can give them some stimulus, and give them some reward for the correct action, and then they learn. And if I'm wrong, you can correct me.
So monkeys, they can learn a lot also planning. And so
yeah, but they can only do it in a sequence of these conditioning things. So more advanced animals like monkeys, they might do more. Yeah.
That's the reason why you left out the most fundamental view of learning, which is data compression.
So that would be in this first thing, right? Learning to discover dependencies could be another point. Learning to discover some regularities in the data, which would lead to data compression.
At least according to algorithmic information theory, compression subsumes all the other kinds of learning that you do.
Not quite. I'm not sure it will subsume the three lower types of learning. Like if you learn to behave, or even the animal learning, does not amount to data compression, right? You cannot really formulate it as like that.
In a certain fundamental sense, but I'm not too keen on going that deep. I think it makes more sense to make these distinctions as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Can you differentiate between skill and behavior?
So behavior is a bit more general. So any change of behavior, if you basically the learning behavior would subsume changing your memory, memorizing something will change your behavior, learning some rule will change your behavior. And skill learning is a bit more specific thing. So skill learning is when you have a particular action, a particular task, and you get very efficient in that. So you get really skilled. So it's closer maybe to habit formation. So behavioral learning is a bit more general actually than skill learning. Okay, so then there will be the question of whether that the monkeys can learn more. So there's a continuum between the animal learning and the human learning, of course. So monkeys are somewhere in between probably. So in studies of infant and adult learning, one can look at memory, how you memorize things on the one hand, and how your memory improves with practice on the other hand. Then you look on learning different rules, how to solve different tasks, or different more or less complex dependencies. Perceptual learning, when you learn to disambiguate different things better, like disambiguate colors better. Like this example of people who work with colors, colors of clothes. They develop better perception, like better discrimination ability for colors. And then you have motor learning, like in dancing, your motor abilities get much better. So this is like what goes into the direction of skill learning. So what we are interested in DFT, so we're interested in neural systems that behave in behavior. So we're interested in this later type of learning, which amounts to learning new skills and new behaviors. And what I call autonomous learning here, because there are different people also understand different things under autonomous learning, is learning which co-occurs with behavior. And this brings us to certain difficulties or constraints. One of them is that behavior is a mass. So as you've heard in the first lectures, behavior unfolds in all this continuous physical space with all the continuous variables that describe stuff in this physical space. The behaving agent can perceive this physical space with its sensors. They are limited. You can only see color, you cannot see ultraviolet or infrared, and the sensors are noisy, so you don't get complete information about the environment. When you try to execute any action, then you face with your motor system, which is also immensely complex with all the joints and muscles and their dynamics, which for the neural system a priori is unknown. And it changes over development or over practice. If you train a lot, then your muscles are different. So your neural system has to deal with that, right? Otherwise, you end up in something like this if you try to learn how to ride a bicycle. So what this leads to is that learning and behavior are very intimately interwoven. On the one hand, behavior, so a priori, if you want the system to behave, it needs to operate with these behavioral variables. Send your arm somewhere, it means send some velocity and send some end effector position, which you want your arm to end on. But in the beginning, this velocity and the end effector position don't mean anything to your neural system. Neural system has no idea what velocity, 1 meter per second mean, or what the neural signal that it would send to a muscle mean. So a priori, all the behavioral variables that we are talking about, they're meaningless to the system. So this means that the system needs to learn what these behavioral variables mean. So in order to behave, the system needs learning, fundamentally. On the other hand, in order to learn to behave, the agent has to behave, has to try stuff out. So you have this chicken and egg problem, that you need learning to behave, you need behavior to learn. And the answer is that you just bootstrap yourself from something very simple and then go in more and more complex. Okay, so we have this learning system and it needs to behave, and behavior is messy. And that's where DFT can come in to help to clean up this behavioral mess. How can it do it? So you have learned all the properties of dynamical fields by now. One of that is that you can insert noisy, varying input to a dynamical field, and it will give you a nice sharp peak that detects some salient information in your input and stabilizes this information. And it also discretizes this information, kind of makes the input to your learning system simpler. It's just this peak. So I'm probably looking at the red thing now. So it helps to detect and stabilize representation of relevant states of the environment. It could be the prevalent color, or it could be some feature of the object that's sharp, or whatever. I'm sorry. On the other hand, if your agent is behaving, then it has to produce actions. And in order to produce an action, it needs to form an intention. I want to move my arm somewhere. And again, dynamical fields can help you to represent these intentions as a stable entity, which will stay around, stay active long enough for your arm to really be moved. So you can imagine your neural system, noisy, it goes up and down the neurons. But this field's dynamics helps you to segregate a decision. I now want to move my arm, and then to keep this decision active long enough for the motor system to actually move the arm. So the second point, it represents and stabilizes the intentions of the agent. So the sensory states on the one hand and the intentions on the other hand. And third, you have these decisions in the dynamical field. So if you form a peak, it's an instability. It's a decision. It's a qualitative change in the system's dynamics. And these decisions, they mark events. I have perceived an object now. I have tried to execute an action. I have finished this action. I failed. And this helps learning to decide when and what to learn. Okay, so that's kind of the motivation and a little bit a scene what we are talking about here. So now I'll go through the learning mechanisms which we have applied and tried out here. They are not all possible learning mechanisms in dynamic neural fields, and I say a few words about other mechanisms at the very end. And in between, I will have these examples. And the examples are more or less complex architectures, which I will try to get through. And if I see that you're like completely drifting off, then I'll probably make it shorter or slower. And feel free to ask questions. So I'll start with the very basic thing. If you look at the sustained activation and its detection instability in a field building a peak, you could see it as an elementary learning process. Because if you remember the definition of learning, learning is change in the system state. And if I have a peak in my field, and this peak is even sustained, then I have changed the state of my system. Now a new input comes in, it's as strong as the initial input was, but its influence on the system is different. So now, for instance, it doesn't have any influence because it's suppressed by the peak present there. So I would claim that sustained activation is the most basic, learning thing, because the state of the system changes in the detection instability. New input will be perceived in a different way than before this detection instability. But you could argue that there's another line or phrase in this definition of learning that it has to be relatively stable. So it's relatively stable, how stable it has to be. The sustained peaks are not very stable. As soon as you get a new strong input, it will decay. So you could argue whether this is already learning or whether it's just part of the behavioral dynamics. And then you can also see that this learning in dynamics is a continuum there. You can see even more advanced types of learning as just part of the dynamics, running on a slower time scale, having different rules and different mathematical equations behind. Okay, the next learning mechanism, which you're already familiar with, is Preshape. Right? Does everyone know what Preshape is? Or was it, yeah? So I'll go through it again. One of the possible equations for that is up there. So if P is your Preshape, and now it's over two-dimensional space. I have an example with a one-dimensional space, but it doesn't matter. So the rate of change of P has two components. One is with the time constant, lambda build, another one with decay. So this governs how fast these changes contribute to the overall change of P. And then the build component, it's how the Preshape is built up. The P has an attractor at the output of the dynamical field for which this Preshape is built, right? If your field is U, then f of u is its output, and then minus p plus f of u tells you that the p has an attractor output of the field. And only at those sides of u where there's activation, that is multiplied with f of u term. And the decay term plays a role in those sites where there's no activation, so 1 minus output of the field, and there the attractor for p is set for 0. So in the field where you have activation, the Preshape grows, this long-term memory trace grows, and where you have no activation, it decays. So just an example, just for you to have some visual thing. So you have some input, this green thing, and the blue activation of the field grows, and then the cyan color is the Preshape. It's built up when you have some input. And as you get new input, Preshape emerges at a new place, and in the old locations it gets weaker. It's kind of some kind of normalization. Now if you have learned these three Preshapes, your field again changes states. Now it has these 3 small bumps underneath. So you really changed your system, the structure of your system. And now you can boost your field, and it will give you an answer. It will select the strongest Preshape. It will memorize what it has learned before. So now I'll give you a few examples of architectures where we have used this principle, because one thing is this principle, the Preshape, another thing to see how it can really change behavior and how you can really learn this Preshape while behaving. So the first example has to do with one of the projects, the first project which was introduced yesterday, which I think didn't get enough attention. So this is project of Claudius Chup. So his task is to study haptic learning. So we have this Schunk hand, robotic hand, with some sensors on its fingertips. And we have a few objects of different shape. So these are different n-gons, 6-gon, 8-gon, with different radius or diameter. And the robot is supposed to turn this object, like this, with 2 fingers, and create a representation of the shape of this object. The kind of data that the robot gets is the following. So when it touches the object, it can estimate whether it touches an edge, because then it will have long, thin pattern on its sensor surface, or whether it touches a surface. Now it gets these 2 types of features, and it has to put them in some space. So they are somewhere on the object. So we assume an object-centered representation, and then what the robot has to do is to estimate the orientation of this feature relative to the object as the object is rotated. And then when you know where to put the feature and you feature, then you could now imagine how you represent this feature as a memory trace in a field. So one view of the architecture would look like this. So these are 2 pathways, one for estimating rotation of the object, another for estimating its location. So we'll look at the rotation only, this one-dimensional case. So you see up there are these errors, these orientation errors. They tell you, the estimated orientation of the feature. Where is this feature relative to some 0 orientation of the object? And the robot gets some input, like with using forward kinematics. It can tell there's an input, these 2 locations. On the 2 locations, because of some artifacts. So on this scheme, you can have some errors and some artifacts. So it assumes there are 2 feature points now. The 2 red bumps in this perceptual field, surface detection field. Then in the other stream, in this gray stream, it does the same, but on a slower time scale, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it builds a memory trace of previous feature detections. So each time it detects a feature, it builds a memory trace for this feature and puts it in the memory trace. Then in the 3rd step, the current sensory input and the memory trace. So this blue line, I'll try to point with this thing. So this blue line here, the memory trace, and the current input, they're merged in the field, in this blue field. And they're merged, it means that they're both inputs. So if you can imagine if this Preshape input and my current input overlap, then they will be pulled together a little bit. Like if they are close enough, they will be pulled together and you'll have output somewhere in the middle. If they are far apart, then your input will get a new trace. So you either merge them or you leave both of them there. So that's what happens in this field. So here this blue output is slightly shifted compared to the current input. It's also slightly shifted compared to the memory trace. And then he has a 3rd step. So this is the transformation field, one of these fields Sebastian Schneegans talked about yesterday morning. And what he does, he puts shifted, this shifted matched input on the one axis and the current input on the other axis. And then by calculating this transformation, this one input relative to the other, that's what transformation field does. It creates a representation of one input that goes into this dimension relative to input that goes in the other dimension. And then if it's not 0, then you have a shift. Then your one input is shifted relative to the other. And then you can estimate this shift, which is an estimate of the error of your current input compared to the memory trace of your previous inputs. And by taking this error, now you can correct your forward kinematics. So now you can correct the shape of your object that you're trying to build. Okay, so as a result, what you get there, if you look at the raw input, so here, these are different orientations relative to the object, so on the object. And this would be different inputs for surfaces, let's say. And you can see that you have this drift over time because you have estimation error in estimation of the location of feature on the object, so that at the end you cannot really say anything about the shape of the object. Now, if you add Preshape to that, so if you add this mechanism with building Preshape and then correcting, matching the current input with the memory, with the Preshape, then you get a little bit better. So your inputs, they stabilize over some time, and then the stabilized inputs, they pull new inputs towards them. And then if you have a new input that is sustained over several iterations, several rotations, then it might change. So at the end, you can say something about the shape of the object. So if you would run any kind of classifier here, it will tell you, this object has 7 edges. In reality, it only has 6, for instance. So here you have much more information than here. And this one, if you do this correction trick, so with the transformation, you estimate the error, you estimate the shift, and you correct your forward kinematics, then you get nice representation of the object at the end. So you have surface here, 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 here. So you can see that it is 6 gone, because it has these surfaces with certain orientation. Okay, is it clear or unclear enough? Okay, another example of using Preshape as a learning mechanism is parsing or learning a sequence of actions. So here we have a following task. We have a robot, it has a depth vision and a color vision and observes a tabletop scene, like over there. And in this scene we have a human hand and it can shift around the objects. So the hand can move towards an object, can touch an object, can move away from an object, potentially can also transport objects, put them together. And this is the architecture that solves this task. So you can see we can segment the colored objects. We can classify and distinguish objects from the hand according to the color or to some other feature. So we have 2 fields. One represents objects, another represents hand. And then we have some system that can analyze motion. So it can detect direction of motion of the hand, can detect whether the hand is moving towards one of the objects or away from one of the objects, or stops ahead of on top of the object. So this is kind of our sensory system. Then we have a second block, which is basically the behavior organization system that Mattis was talking about. Mattis Richter, this behavior organization system with intentions and conditions of satisfaction. So here we basically have a bunch of these elementary behaviors with intentions and conditions of satisfactions. They are here. So we have this, we call them here action detectors, because here they work the other way around. They're not behaviors, they're used as action detectors. So by observing an action, I can tell, well, he's reaching now, he's grasping now, he's dropping the object now. Later, I could use the same system to produce the behavior, but here it works in the perceiving side. So we call them action detectors. And there's some stuff around it. So for instance, object selection selects one of the objects towards which the hand is moving. This would be the target object, and we represent its color. And these are detection fields. They detect objects, hands, motion, approach, or away movement towards or away from the object. And then, and now coming to learning slowly, but steadily, we have the ordinal system. Again, something Mattis was talking about, the serial order system that can represent serial positions in any sequence, like first, second, third. And this system is linked to our action detectors, reach, grasp, drop, and to the colors of the object. So each of the ordinal nodes potentially has these links to colors and to actions. And now, while the system observes teacher or human performing the actions, these detectors become activated. So like intention of the reach, let's say, will be activated, and the green color, so I'm reaching towards the green object. This state will be active. And in my ordinal system, the first node will be active. And the two now can get connected to each other. So they get linked to each other, so that the first node now represents this action. And this connection will be solved by using Preshape dynamics. I think I won't tell you in detail how, but you probably can see. So now it's kind of zoomed in on the action detector. So this reach, grasp, and drop action detector has these two fields. The condition here, it's condition of initiation and not intention, but it's the same function, but used in the other way around, in the perceptual sense. This would be the node that represents condition of initiation. I observe someone starting to perform a reaching action. So I think he is performing a reaching action. Now when the reaching action will be finished, there will be a condition of termination or condition of satisfaction. He has now finished performing a reaching action, and by that I can now write my reaching action into the memory, which means into these connections from ordinal nodes to the reach, grasp, or drop detectors. And these links, they can be learned by the Preshape dynamics, by building the memory trace. Is that clear? How that can be done? Okay, so now just again, kind of the the result or how it looks in reality. So this would be the typical visual scene with 3 objects and the hand. This is how they are segregated into objects and the hand. And these are 2 fields, output of 2 fields that represent the objects and the hand. And this field has the 3rd dimension, the color of the objects. Now when the user moves his hand towards or away of the object, we have the system that detects the direction of movement and also detects the objects towards which this movement is directed. Like here the green object and here the blue object. And then what we have at the end, this is for one action. So the user reaches towards the green object, going over the red object on the way. So you can see, so the blue one is the condition of satisfaction for reach. So you can see the reach action is detected over there, and this 3, where the 3 is. And in the action memory, the blue line for reach gets activated, and it stores the fact that the first action was reach. And then the same happens for grasp, the red thing, and for drop, the green thing. And at the same time, the system also memorizes the colors of objects. This would be color field, this is the color dimension. It's red somewhere here, and there's green over here. It's green, green, green. So now the system remembered that the sequence is reach for green, grasp green, and drop green. Okay, here's a small video that explains this all. So again, this is the visual scene. This is the selected object of the action. This is the serial order system. We'll see what is in there. And here you'll see activation each time one of the actions is detected. And these are the serial order nodes, the ones that Matis explained to you, which represent the sequence. That's not good. Second. And we'll do it differently. See it better than I do. So he moves his hand towards the blue object, and there's now the reach and the touch or the grasp is detected. And you can see here are the actions that you detected. The blue nodes get active. They transition to from one to the next node when they detect transitions between the actions. So now he did reach, drop, grasp with the blue object. Now he does the same with the red object. So this would be reach, grasp is when he touches the object. So this move object is not in there yet, and now it will be drop. Okay, so that's the sequence. And now he will show what is stored in the memory of the system. So this is the cedar architecture behind. Now he'll close one of the plots and show you that in the Preshape, between the ordinal node and the action detectors and the colors, there are these Preshapes, and they store on one hand different colors, and on the other hand different actions which are in there. So these are 3, or like one color and then the second color, so 2 different colors. It was 3 times blue and 3 times red. And in connections to the action detectors, there's 0 for grasp and drop. And there's the node is at 1 for the appropriate action. So you can see that the system now stores the sequence. And now if you would press the go button, it will be able to execute this sequence, depending on how you connect your detectors to the motor system. Okay, you don't see the last bit, but that's how it goes. Okay. So now the next point. So until now you had this Preshape, and the dimensionality of the Preshape was the same as the dimensionality of the field that represents colors or motor comments or whatever. You can have a more complex case if your Preshape is higher dimensional than your fields. And by this mechanism you can store associations between two fields, for instance. Like here you would have this transition or association field T. It has dynamic field equation or dynamics. So this F lateral are the normal lateral interactions with the integral over output of the field multiplied with the kernel. In other words, you have the field dynamics has two inputs. Like here, one coming, let's say, from some visual field and another coming from some motor field. You see that the visual field is over one dimension, which is x, and the motor field is over a different dimension, which is y, and your transition field has both dimensions there. This means that your one-dimensional inputs are projected onto this field, and by that we mean that they are copied in the missing dimension. And you can see how it looks like in a moment. And then kind of below this field T, you have the Preshape, the two-dimensional Preshape of this field. Then it has the normal Preshape dynamics. And what is missing here, one term, that this Preshape feeds back to the T field. So actually there's another term plus P, X, and Y in the T field. So what you can do with that is the following. So let's say now a visual field we have some input, and it is projected in the two-dimensional field. And then in the motor field you also have some input, and I decided not to make it on their edge, and it also projects onto this field. Where the two inputs cross, there you have enough activation to pass the activation threshold. So the peak is built in where they cross, and this peak leaves a memory trace. And now you can shift the inputs, so imagine there's a different situation, different stimulus-response association, a different combination of inputs coming in into different locations. Again, you have a peak where they cross, and you have a memory trace where the peak is located. Okay, now these memory traces are long-term memories, so they stay there. And now you can see there are these two bumps coming from the Preshape in your association field. So that if now you set input to one of the fields in the location that overlaps with this Preshape, your second field will get some input. So it's very weak here, but it's enough to induce a peak. If I boost this field, this motor field, it will get me the answer. So you can see how you can store stimulus-response associations here or any other associations in this manner. Now again, a few applications of that. Two, I think. So the first one is that we use this mechanism to represent value function in a neural dynamic reinforcement learning agent. So this reinforcement learning agent had a very simple task: discover a sequence of colors. So we just said this sequence of colors is rewarding. So the agent would try to look at different colors in any order, explore, and when by chance it does this sequence, it will get a reward. Not very often, especially in the beginning. And now in a typical reinforcement learning scenario, the agent is supposed to learn this sequence. So when it gets the reward, it can now know that can backpropagate this rewarding signal into the sequence that it has just accomplished. And by that, increase the value of transitions from one state to another, if these transitions led to a reward. So this is the architecture that does that. It looks complex, but it's actually not. Yeah?
So in the same, if the robot sees some other colors in between, then they still have that sequence of particular colors.
So he really has to do this sequence with no other colors in between. Yeah, so it's like, the analogy would be in order to grasp an object, you have to open your gripper and then move and then close. And if you do anything between, you destroy the sequence. So you really have to do this sequence. So that would be the system. At the core of it, this thing in the middle, and these two colorful lines are intention and condition of satisfaction nodes of elementary behavior. So this robot has 4 elementary behaviors. It can look at objects of 4 different colors here. Just for simplification of showing this thing. It can look at red, green, blue, and yellow color, and it has intention of looking at it, and it has condition of satisfaction. I have looked at this color. Now, what the correct sequence amounts to is to correct connections from the condition of satisfaction of these behaviors to the next intention. So the robot has to learn, when I have looked at the green object, the next I should search for a blue one. And when I have found the blue one, I should search for the yellow one. So the sequence is represented by connections from conditions of satisfactions to intentions. And now we can view these connections as the value function of these transitions from conditions of satisfaction to intentions. In this value function is represented in these value nodes, which are basically this transition field, as the transition field in the previous, slide. So that when this field is correctly learned, so you have correct entries here. If the condition of satisfaction, if the blue condition of satisfaction is active, for instance, then it will activate the next intention, let's say the green one. Now the rest is just the mechanics, the reinforcement learning mechanics, how to learn it. And it consists of this field that represents the most recent transition. It's like state action field transition representation. So if I had the green object and then I selected the red one, this would be one transition and it will be represented here. And then there's some mechanism how to calculate whether this transition, in reinforcement learning, transition brings you to some new state, and this state has certain value. So if this value is higher than the value of your previous state, you increase the value of your previous state. So there's this mechanics of reinforcement learning, and that's what is done here with these transitive pulse cells and the eligibility traces. They keep track of the actions that you have executed previously, so you get the highest eligibility trace for the most recent transition, and then lesser and lesser for the transitions that were before. And depending on these eligibility trace, you update the transitions more or less. So if you get into a very nice rewarding state, which has high value, it means it brings you closer to the goal, and you'll update the previous state slightly. You'll update one state before a bit less, and then 2 states before even less, and then like 5 states before you probably won't update at all. And that's what these 3 modules are doing, and they calculate the new value for different transitions. So an important difference here to traditional reinforcement learning systems is that your states are the actions. In reinforcement learning, you normally have a state space, and then your actions are transitions from one state to another. Here, this transition, and here your action, your state is actually an action. So your state is actually a transition from the state before the action to the state after the action. And what is considered actions in reinforcement learning are just transitions from one action to the next one. So it kind of shifts slightly the view on the reinforcement learning problem. And another important feature here, so what happens here is just you update this memory representation of the transitions, and you kind of value the good ones better than those that didn't bring you any reward.
Could you use the ordinal nodes that you're using for keeping track of what part of the sequence you're in as the states, in a sense, like instead of having to use the specific actions as the states?
So if you would use the ordinal nodes, your ordinal nodes will project onto some actions. So they will project into some intentions, and each ordinal node also corresponds to some action, which is a state. So your action is a state. If I move my arm, that's a state in which I am in. And in classical reinforcement learning, your actions are instantaneous. Just go from one state to another, and they don't take any time. And here, they take different amounts of time, and you need to stabilize your actions. Okay, so what I wanted to say is that what you do here is basically update this memory trace, but what is important is when you update it. So you have to update this memory trace when you have the representation of the previous condition of satisfaction active and the representation of the new intention active. So here you can see how this neural dynamics helps you to learn only when you are supposed to learn, so only when the relevant representations are there. You don't learn all the time, you only learn when you know that the relevant representations are currently active. Okay, just for completeness, one slide of the results. So the system can really learn that. It had to learn the sequence of 4 colors. It still has needed like many steps in order to, for the first time, find the sequence of 4 elements. You can imagine like combinatorially, it's not that easy to find the sequence of 4 elements just by chance. But at the moment when it has found it, then it exploits and it can learn the sequence very quickly by this mechanism. Okay, so this was the first example. The second example is from the same group and from this similar system. By the way, this was done by our colleagues in Lugano, and there are a few papers about that, so if you're interested, I can point you to that. So here we used, again, the memory trace in this higher dimensional field to learn condition of satisfaction. So if you remember in elementary behavior, there's intention and there's a condition of satisfaction. And intention performs an action. Condition of satisfaction detects that the action is finished. And there was this link from intention to condition of satisfaction that makes it sensitive to that particular input that corresponds to finishing an action. And in Mattis's story, this link is fixed. So if I look for color, I know, then if I have this color, let's say in the middle, like near my nose, that's when I am satisfied. And if I want to move my hand, then when I touch the object, that's when I am satisfied. Or if I want to move my hair, then when my joints are at the values that I wanted them to be at, that's when I'm satisfied. I just built it in for some systems. And there's a natural question arises, how does the system know that that's when this action is finished? And this is something that the system has to be able to learn at some point. And this is just a proof of concept demonstration that that's possible. And the scenario is following. So this is this Kepler robot. It looks at a rich environment. And it's supposed to look for red color, which is the color of an apple. And this color is supposed to satisfy the hunger drive of this robot. So it has to learn that if it's hungry, then it should be satisfied if it faces a red apple. And if it's thirsty, then it's satisfied if it faces the yellow bottle. So it learns what stimulus will satisfy a particular action. You have to have something in the beginning, so these drives, this hunger or thirst drives, we assume them to be built in. Yeah.
Yes, but in this picture, there's also another thing like a red card or red piece of paper. How does what you differentiate whether one of the apple and the other is
And the other are not. So here the color is the only feature how you can distinguish the object. So if the system will be in this configuration, it will always see this red thing behind the apple, and this is when it will get the reward. Then it will learn it together. It cannot distinguish red apple from red anything else. Yeah, that's true. So here it only had this one feature, color, to distinguish objects. And I think the shade of this red is probably different than the shade of the apple, so it will learn it away. So the principle how it learns is that it turns around, and at the moment when it faces an apple, it will get a rewarding signal. Now the drive is satisfied, its hunger is satisfied, and it will leave a memory trace of whatever colors it currently is seeing. And the trick is that when looking at apple from different locations, it will see different backgrounds, and over time in the memory trace they will average out, and it will always see a red apple when satisfied, and then the red will become stronger and stronger. So basically there's a small architecture to do that. So this is the intention node, condition section node, intention field, condition section field defined over color. No, the intention field is defined over these intentions we just came with. One was for thirst, for hunger, and for sleep, something like that. And the condition of satisfaction gets colors, this perception field, and it gets colors. And it gets reward once in a while. Like depending on the primary intention, it will get different rewards. And then we have this something that is called weight matrix, but which is basically the same Preshape mechanism that I was talking about. It gets two inputs, one from the intention, with location of the drive, another from the color, with location of the color. And this input it will only get if reward is there. So reward boosts this condition section field. It will build one or several peaks where the salient colors are currently located, and then it will learn this connection over time. Yeah, so again, the principle is like that. You have intention, or here this drive DNF, and then you have condition of satisfaction. If two overlap, you get this Preshapes built at correct associations. And in this simple proof of concept implementation, which by the way was implemented in one of the summer schools a few years ago, this is how it looks like. This is a camera image. This is the perceptual field, which has one spatial dimension. So this is this horizontal space, and the other dimension is color. So you can see there's something gray probably here, and there's red over there, and there's yellow in the middle. And this condition of satisfaction just gets input projected in the color dimension here. It's cut here a little bit. And this is the intention. Now currently it's thirst, let's say. And this is these weight fields. So these are the three, the location of three drives over this dimension. And here you have the colors. And you can see the system has learned, hunger is red color and thirst is yellow color. These are the colors, red, yellow, green, and so on. The other way around. The colors. Okay, then we have had a slightly advanced version of that, but in principle it's the same. So, but it just to qualify the system a little bit better, we had the simulated now robot. It was looking at two objects. One would satisfy a hunger drive, and another one would satisfy a thirst drive, and it will get rewards correspondingly. And then the background color will just change randomly. And what they demonstrated is just that over time, in the memory trace, the random background gets averaged out, and the colors of the drives are learned. So you can see here, it's looking on at the pink object. We have one of the drives active, the thirst drive, let's say. And for this drive, pink is the rewarded color. So the condition of satisfaction is activated. There are two peaks there, one for pink and one for yellow for the background. And then at the next trial, the background color, at the next equivalent trial, the background color will change. So one of the peaks will be more shifted to green and to blue. And here the Preshape will average out, and here the Preshape will grow. And if it faces the blue object and there's no reward, so nothing happens. And then the same for the second drive, for the hunger drive. It's get rewarded for the blue object. So here it's when the condition second gets boosted. Again, it builds a peak for the blue color and for the green, yellow, whatever color the background has. And this other color gets averaged out, and the blue color grows. And here it does not get rewarded if it faces the pink color. So the condition satisfaction is sub-threshold. So again, you can see what is important here is that the dynamic field has this detection instability, and then it tells you when to learn and when not to learn. If there's no reward, you don't learn, because there's no output in the condition satisfaction field. These learning weights won't be brought above the activation threshold, no learning. If there is a reward, then you have an output and there is learning. So you can see how this condition of satisfaction and intentions, they bring different parts of the architecture up and down, and by that decide who participates in the dynamics, and in particular in learning, and who doesn't. Okay, so now you've already seen on the previous slides that sometimes this Preshape thing, this two-dimensional Preshape, was called weights. And this is one way how you can look at it, and one way how you can implement it. So you can implement this association with a different equation, but with the equivalent behavior, so to say. So here, again, you have two spaces, and you want to find out association between them. They're two-dimensional here, so that you can just see that they can be two-dimensional as well. And then the equation to update this association is the following. So the T, and now it has 4 dimensions, x, y, for the visual space, and K and L for the motor space. And there's some learning factor. And then this match field, I'll tell you in a minute what that is. It's basically some rewarding signal. So the learning takes place if there's some reward, and the learning amounts to setting a tractor for your weights matrix to a cross product of your inputs. So if you would have a two-dimensional case, you would again have an input coming in this direction, an input coming in that direction, and you would update the connection between these two inputs in the location where the two inputs cross. So functionally, it is equivalent to this two-dimensional Preshape mechanism that I was talking about. The equation is slightly different, but the result is the same. And now if you look at this equation, this is basically Hebbian learning. How many of you know what Hebbian learning is? Fire together, wire together. If two inputs are active at the same time, like particular location in one field, particular location in another field, then the connections between them are strengthened. It's the same principle here. So here's a small example of that. We have this pan and tilt camera set. So a small camera setting on the pan and tilt unit can look left, right, and up and down. And the task for this camera is to learn to look at objects. And by looking, I mean emitting a motor signal to foveate an object. So not just do visual surveying and drag yourself to the object, but to look at the object immediately. And a priori, the system doesn't know how to do that. It has this perception of the objects on its retina, and there's one salient blob. So it knows where the target is in the image, but it doesn't know at all how to, what motor command, what pan and tilt to send in order to look at that object. So we can represent this motor command in another field, which is at the beginning is activated randomly. I'll tell you in a minute when. So if there's a peak somewhere in this field, then it will move, set attractor at this particular pen and tilt of the camera. So it will look at that location. And then between the two, there's a weight matrix. It's a four-dimensional thing. Probably Sebastian has mentioned such four-dimensional fields and how we represent them. So here you see the small tiles. Each one of them corresponds to this visual field. And the collection of tiles overall corresponds to the motor field. So this would be K, L, and then there are small X and Y repeated. Yeah? So like just a way to represent four-dimensional matrix. And now this matrix connects this field to this field, all-to-all connections, and it runs according to that equation. So if there's a peak here, and there's a peak here, and there's a rewarding signal coming in from up there, then the certain location in this field will be updated. Like here, for instance, this blob corresponds to this guy, or the other way around probably. And then inside, in each tile, the peak will correspond to peak in the other field. Now here again, it's important that this learning only happens if there's a peak here, there's a peak here. It means that I know what intention I had before I have moved my camera, and I know what motor command I executed before I moved the camera. And I know that after the movement, because only after the movement I know whether this movement was correct or not. And this is again the important function of dynamical fields here, because they keep the memory around of the intentions which were created before the movement. So you can imagine if I had my input here before the movement, then after the movement, this visual input will be somewhere else because I have moved my camera. But this intention peak will stay active because I have made it stable enough that it's self-sustained and it will keep around the visual intention before the movement occurred. And again, here I have emitted this motor command and the movement has already happened, but I still have this motor command around. And then if I happen to have looked correctly, so my input happens to be in the middle of the visual field, this visual match field will detect that by just having some Preshape in the middle of the field. And if there's an activity there, then I will learn that for this visual location, this motor command is a good idea to choose. Yeah?
Because the movements are like random and that also? Or?
So in the beginning, they are random, and that's defined by random initialization of this matrix. So and it's updated, so there's noise in this matrix. So in the beginning, there's an input here, and it will result in some output here. So then there's these dynamics, similar to what Gregor was mentioning in one of his first lectures. So if there's a peak here, it sticks around, and then it moves the camera to this pan and tilt, which is defined by this input here. Or it will more exactly move it like into delta pan and delta tilt, depending on where the peak is in that field. And this movement here is just a simple dynamics. It just drags camera into this attractor. Yeah, is that sense?
Yeah, and then it's also rewarded. It's maybe not going just coming in the middle, but close by.
So in this particular implementation, we only rewarded it if it's in the middle, if it was a correct action. Now we're working on an extension where we'll also take errors into account and then correct the map, even if using the error. And they'll come to a different system where we use errors to learn a mapping like that, different mapping. Okay? So that's the end of the story for Preshape and for learning these mappings. So you can imagine how this mechanism helps you to learn different mappings. It can be mapping between the stimulus and response, and can be mapping between visual and motor representation. It can be mapping between any two spaces, if they're not too high dimensional maybe. Now with different mechanisms that we have worked with is what we call error-driven gain map adaptation. So here, again, an example. So example will be a looking system again, but this time, we wanted to make sure that the looking has something to do with the real saccades that humans are doing. So it has this velocity profile of saccadic eye movement, which has a stereotypical velocity profile, something Gaussian like that. It's not exactly like that, but some Gaussian, like slightly skewed Gaussian thing. And the architecture is as follows. So we have a neural oscillator, neural transient generator that generates this profile. Go up, go down. And then we send this profile to the motors of the robot, and they generate velocity profile. Velocity goes up, velocity goes down to 0. That's the looking action. In the beginning, the agent doesn't know, like for a particular target location, how far it should go. So in the beginning, it will make the same saccades for all targets. And what it's supposed to learn is to make longer saccades for targets that are farther away and smaller saccades for targets that are closer. And we generate these saccades of different amplitude by scaling this velocity profile. So if it will be low, it will be a short saccade. If it's high, it will be long saccades. And we do it in 2 dimensions, for horizontal and for vertical motion. So what we have then is that we have our perceptual thing, let's say with 3 objects, we select one of them and say this is the visual representation of the target. Then we have a maps, the gain maps, which have some value, which is then multiplied with this profile basically. So by these ways we just read out the value of the map which corresponds to location of our target, and we scale the velocity profile with that. And these maps can be learned using this equation in the following way. So one thing maybe to understand that these maps, here they are shown to be just 2-dimensional. And the 2 dimensions correspond to different target locations. That's the obvious thing. If your target is far, you want to have high value in that map. If your target is close, you want to have low value in that map. And this you can see like vertically for far targets. If they're here, you will have large value. So we'll make long vertical saccade, and for targets which are close to this horizontal, to the 0 line, you'll have small saccades. And the same for horizontal. I just cannot point that far. So the targets which are far away have higher values. But you have to take into account more, because it happens that this map are different for different starting positions of your head. So if I start from here, then looking to a target which is here needs a different gain than if I start from here and look here. And the reason why that cell is different for human and for the robot. For the robot it is because the camera of the robot sits on some complex structure. If you imagine this is where I move my head, my camera is shifted like this and shifted like this and maybe shifted like this, and that's where my chip is. So now if I do the same movement from here, I need a different different amplitude of motion than if I do the same visual movement from here. So you can imagine I have some visual error which I want to get rid of. I want to center the object in my fovea, but I need to do completely different movements when I'm looking like this and when I'm looking like that. So it's the geometry of the robot. For humans, the eye sits more or less on the rotation axis, more or less. But the muscles have their dynamical properties. So it's you need a different neural signal to make the same retinal motion when you're watching there and you want to make a saccade over there than if you are looking down there and make a saccade down over there. Is that clear? Yeah?
If I understand this correctly, will this produce saccades always at the same duration at different velocities, or will it produce saccades with both different velocities?
So here, in this particular implementation, it will produce saccades of the same duration, approximately the same duration. And it's approximately like what you find in human saccades in certain range. Not always. If you go then to other movements, like for arm movements, then it's not true anymore because you can have different durations. And there we have different mechanisms how to produce movement. And we're still working on that. So it's, yeah.
So here it has to do with the kinematic of the robot.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering about the generalization of things, like even several training points can generalize to different points.
Mm-hmm. So if I have like the initial position of my robot is defined by 2 values, right? It's the pen and tilt. It's the 2 motors I can move. So the initial, I have 2 dimensions there. And then my visual system, also 2 dimensions, x and y. So if I have this map and it's 4-dimensional, then I will be able to learn this mapping. Might take a while. I'll say a few words about that. So I need a rich enough environment to do that, but I will be able to learn this mapping, however complex it is. Even if my camera is located in some weird configuration, still a 4-dimensional mapping which is behind, and then the system will be able to learn it. If I only take 2-dimensional map, then I won't be able to learn it because there are 2 dimensions are missing, which are actually relevant.
So the method will successfully
At the end, when it's learned, yeah. When the system is learned, it will be able to look at the object from any, like, it depends on how you're learning. If you really do systematic learning, so you put objects in all possible visual locations from all possible starting position, you learn the map, then you will be able to make correct saccades from any initial configuration to any retinal position. Yeah, this will take a while, and this will take this unnatural procedure of just placing objects everywhere and sampling the whole space. Yeah, so this is how learning goes on. So one is this C-on is one of these intention or conditional satisfaction nodes in a large architecture, which I'll show you in a minute. So this node tells you, I have done the saccade. Yeah, that's it actually. So I have done the saccade. And then this module will tell me, and there's an error. And the error means that my input is not in the fovear. It's somewhere off the fovear. And more than that, we have a more or less neurally plausible method how to estimate the sign of the error, whether my saccade was too short or too long. So you can imagine if I remember where my target was, and I know where my target is after the saccade, I can look, are they still on the same side of the midline or on the different sides of the midline, then I can know whether it's too short or too long in the two dimensions, vertical and horizontally. So I have my error sign. And then these two terms, they only tell me the location where I have to update my gain maps. So the location where I have activity in my target field, so where the visual target was, to this blob, and where my motor system was before the saccade, so which pan and tilt I had before the saccade. It will select one of these maps. So you can imagine there's a whole bunch of these maps, actually four-dimensional, like a two-dimensional matrix of this map that corresponds to different pan and tilts before the saccade. So these two guys tell me where. Shall I push this gain map up or down slightly? If the saccade was too short, I put it up. If it was too long, I push it down. Okay, what else to say about that? Let's see. This is the overall architecture. And one of the groups you can play around with it. So we have it implemented in Cedar. You can look at different parts, what they do. And the different parts are, so one is the perception, and this is the standard thing. You have motors and camera of the agent, and the camera gives you some visual input, and you have this color space field, something you've heard from Stefan Zipner, right? This representation of the visual scene and retinal coordinates. And then you have the color extracted separately and kept in memory, the color of the selected target. And then you have this gaze perception that tells you where my eye was before the movement. And then I have the saccade generator system, which has this neural oscillator, I would say, with a few nodes around it, which generates me this activation profile, go up, go down. And this activation profile is eventually sent to motors of the robot. And before it's sent to the robots, it's scaled here with these gain maps. And you see the gain maps are four-dimensional structure, which I learned. And this guy selects the visual target. And then this too far, too close module estimates the direction of the error, whether the saccade was too short or too long, and then changes learning accordingly. Then we have a fixation system. So between the saccades, the system tries to track the object for a while, and while tracking the object, it creates a memory of this object, of its color, in its location, and its location in the gaze space. I don't talk about this here. So this plot that just demonstrates the learning. So we start with random gains, and then over time we get these maps in 4 dimensions. You can see after 200 saccades, 400 saccades, 600, 850,000 saccades, you have the whole map learned. If you place the objects systematically. So now we are playing around with just now robot and the real world scenes. If your scene only has one object, you'll only learn as much in this map. If your scene only has 3 objects, and this is all that the robot sees, it will learn slightly more, but also not much. So that tells you that the environment matters. And the system won't be able to learn much, to learn the complete map if its only faces limited environment. That's why it's important that children have some colorful and playrooms with lots of objects in them. And this is again like how the system scans the scene. So it sees 3 objects, and we have this saliency-based object selection mechanism. So the largest object is the red one, so it will be the one the system looks at first. And then we have this color memory for the object which have been looked at, and this memory inhibits this color. It's kind of like a habituation. So now the system will be less interested in the red object, and we'll look at the different objects. So here, the only object it sees is the yellow one, so it will look at the yellow one, put it to memory, habituate to it. Yellow is not interested anymore, it will look at, and red is not interested yet because it's still in memory, and then it will look at the blue object. So here the system has already learned, and as you can see, it can foveate the objects correctly. And this just shows that the system can also build a scene representation of the objects. Okay, that's basically it. So now a few words of the learning mechanisms which I didn't mention here. So one thing is so I have started with fields, and even with more than a field, for learning I already need some intentions and conditions of satisfactions. And one very basic question is where does connectivity in the neural field come from? And there are some methods how you can learn it and how you can do that. Yeah.
So you've been writing.
Yeah.
Projected some has arrived.
Okay. Like using self-organizing maps algorithm, you can show how you can learn this connectivity. Or you can look at this network as a radial basis function network, and then also you can show how connectivity and maybe some inhomogeneities in the field can be learned. Some people learn asymmetrical inhomogeneous connections in the field, and I think maybe Jean-Charles will talk a little bit about that. So by that you can store some trajectories in the field. So if you have some moving targets, and the peak moves in the field, you can let it leave trace in the interaction kernel of the field, making it asymmetrical on the way. So that next time you put input into in the beginning of the trajectory, it will move along the trajectory. If you have asymmetrical kernel, it shifts your peak towards the direction of the asymmetry, and then it faces new asymmetry, and then it will follow the trajectory. Another thing which I didn't talk about is the using prediction for learning. Like here, we had this very simple cases when the rewarding signal was just coming from the outside. Either when I face the object, when the object is in my fovea, that's rewarding, or I have this hunger and thirst drives, so that's rewarding. So the reward comes from outside the system. If you add this predictive component, so if you let the system predict what will happen next, then it can generate rewards by itself. I predict something, if that's true, then it's good. I did something like my system is probably correct. If my prediction is not true, then I have to change my system. And this may be also something which Jean-Charles will talk about a little bit. Okay, and the conclusions. So one conclusion, as you have seen, I had these learning architectures, and none of them just started with a white sheet of paper and with nothing in place. So structure is needed for learning. And the assumption is some of the structure is probably innate. We have all the genes and all the evolution behind us to have some of the structure in place for learning. And on the other hand, structure and behavior can co-evolve. So you need something to start with, and then you can bootstrap from there. Like for instance, we need representations for intentions, conditions of satisfaction, and conditions of dissatisfaction, good and bad stuff. And you can imagine how that could be innately encoded already. You don't want to feel pain and hunger and all that. And you need some basic sensory motor representations in place, which you can then tune later. Then the second point is that the environment in which learning unfolds matters. If you only have one object in the environment, you won't be able to learn much. So you need rich environments to learn. And even more, if your environment is very complex and you want to learn something complex, it probably won't be possible without a teacher. So teacher guidance, something like scaffolding, like making simple tasks in which you succeed and then making them more complex, or shaping, like when you also learn step by step to more complex things, may be needed to learn complex behaviors. Okay. If you have any more questions, you're welcome to get rid of them.